During your wedding shrouded in mystery and ancient traditions, Babalwa's unbroken silence holds more significance than anyone realizes. As the ceremony progresses, strange and unsettling events begin to unfold, leaving the village gripped by fear. Lungelo, her devoted groom, begs her to speak, unaware of the deep danger that lies within her voice. What follows is a heart-wrenching choice that will forever alter their lives and the fate of the entire village. The true power of Babalwa's silence is revealed in a chilling, unexpected twist. Can Babalwa's silence truly save them all? Or will her voice unleash a curse no one can stop? In the remote village of Khanya, nestled in the shadow of the ancient Nkanyezi forest, life moved at a pace dictated by tradition and whispered superstitions. It was a place untouched by time, where people lived as their ancestors had for centuries, tending to their stock, gathering from the land, and fearing the unseen forces that washed from the dense trees. The village elders often spoke of things best left unsaid, warnings passed down through generations, woven into the very fabric of life. It was here that the villagers spoke of Babalwa, the bride who never spoke. From the day she was born, she had never uttered a single word, her voice as elusive as the wind that whispered through the trees. Yet, Babalwa was no ordinary woman. Her beauty was unparalleled, her dark eyes deep pools of mystery, and her quiet grace a source of fascination. Though she never spoke, her silence seemed to carry weight, as if her thoughts and feelings existed in another realm entirely. She was respected, but there was always a quiet fear beneath the surface, something the villagers could never quite explain. Babalwa had grown up in the house of Nkanyezi, her mother, who was revered in the village for her wisdom and deep connection to the land. Her mother rarely spoke of Babalwa's silence, though there was a sense that she understood its cause. The villagers whispered about curses, about the spirits of the Nkanyezi forest, but none dared to speak too loudly. In Khanya, there were certain truths that could only be whispered. Despite her silence, many young men in the village had tried to court Babalwa, drawn by her beauty and her gentle spirit. But it was Lungelo, a foreigner, who captured her heart. Lungelo had come to Khanya from the bustling city far to the north, a man of industry and trade, his hands rough from hard work, but his eyes bright with curiosity. The people of Khanya viewed him with a mix of awe and suspicion, for he was an outsider, unfamiliar with the villagers' customs and old ways. Lungelo, however, saw in Babalwa something beyond his silence. He saw a quiet strength, a kindness that went beyond words, and a mystery that he longed to unravel. Though they never spoke to each other, they found other ways to communicate, through gestures, exchanged glances, and notes written carefully on scraps of paper. It wasn't long before he asked Nkanyezi for Babalwa's hand in marriage. The villagers were shocked, for no one had ever gotten that close to her, and they whispered of old legends and curses tied to Babalwa's lineage. Despite their murmurs, Nkanyezi agreed, her deep-set eyes unreadable. But the old man who sat by the village fires at night spoke of things best left undisturbed. They warned Lungelo, speaking of a curse that followed the women in Babalwa's family, a curse tied to their silence. It was said that if a bride like Babalwa were to ever speak on her wedding day, a terrible curse would befall her and her groom. Lungelo dismissed the stories as the ramblings of old men steeped in superstition. He believed that love could conquer anything, and he was willing to take Babalwa's hand despite whatever shadows clung to her past. He could not imagine that her silence hid anything but sorrow. He believed he could bring joy to her life, break the bonds of her quiet suffering, and perhaps one day hear her voice. Still, a small part of him questioned her silence. He would watch her sitting by the window, her gaze distant, as if lost in thought. He wanted to ask her about the legends, about why she had never spoken, but he never dared. After all, what harm could her silence truly cause? He often wondered what her voice might sound like, a thought that lingered at the edges of his mind. He loved her deeply, but he could not help but feel there was something hidden beneath the silence, something he didn't fully understand. As the wedding day approached, the village buzzed with both excitement and apprehension. They'd never seen Babalwa smile so often, and though she remained silent, there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. Yet, deep in the shadows of the Nkanyezi forest, something ancient stirred. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that made animals restless, and villagers glanced nervously over their shoulders. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the elders sat by their fires, speaking in harsh tones.
"She must not speak,"
said Mfundo, the oldest of them all.
"If she does, we will all be lost."
But Lungelo, full of love and ambition, refused to listen. He saw only his future with Babalwa, the life they would build together. Little did he know, her silence was not just a burden she carried, it was a shield protecting them all from something far darker than any of them could imagine. The day of the wedding arrived, and the village of Khanya was alive with a nervous energy. Brightly colored fabrics were strung between homes, and the air was filled with smells of cooking fires and incense. Yet, beneath the festive exterior, a sense of unease lingered. The elders watched from the edges of the gathering, their faces marked with concern, while the younger villagers celebrated with music and laughter, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. The wedding was to take place at Tsika's Hill, a sacred site overlooking the village. It was tradition for couples in Khanya to marry there, under the vast sky, with the ancient Nkanyezi forest standing guard in the background. Babalwa arrived draped in a white dress adorned with delicate beadwork, her long braids tucked under a veil of shimmering silk. Though she moved gracefully, there was a weight in her eyes, as if she were walking towards something more than a union with the man she loved. Lungelo stood at the altar, beaming with pride, his heart full of love for the woman walking toward him. He noticed the whispers among the villagers, the way the elders exchanged worried glances, but he pushed the thoughts away. To him, today was about love, not old superstitions. He had spent his life building a future in the city, conquering the challenges of business and forging his own path. What harm could there be in a story passed down by frightened villagers? And yet, as Babalwa approached, that familiar doubt crept in. The silence that had once enchanted him now felt like a gap, a distance he couldn't cross. He had never truly questioned it before, but today was different. Why did she never speak? What was she holding back? The ceremony began, led by Thandolwethu, the village priestess. She was a woman of great wisdom, with a voice as steady as the river that cut through the valley. Her words were poetic and strong, blessing the union in the traditional way of Khanya. But even she could not hide the slight tremor in her voice as she approached the vows, the part of the ceremony where traditionally both the bride and groom were to speak. Lungelo went first. His voice was clear and strong, as he spoke his vows of love, his promises of protection, and his dreams of a future together. The villagers watched in awe, moved by the passion in his words. Even the elders, for a moment, seemed to relax, charmed by the strength of his conviction. Then came Babalwa's turn. The air grew heavy with expectation as all eyes turned to the silent bride. A cold wind whispered through the trees, sending a shiver through the crowd. Even the animals in the distance seemed to grow still, as if waiting for something. Babalwa stood before Lungelo, her eyes filled with love, yet shadowed by an ancient sorrow. The priestess turned to her, waiting for the bride to say the words that would complete the bond. But Babalwa did not speak. Her lips remained pressed together, her hands clutched tightly around the bouquet of wild flowers. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken, and the weight of it pressed down on the gathering like a storm cloud waiting to break. For a moment, Lungelo smiled, thinking this was part of the ceremony, that perhaps her silence was just a symbol of the mystery that had drawn him to her. But as the moment stretched on and the wind grew colder, he began to feel a flicker of doubt. The villagers shifted uneasily, the murmurs of concern growing louder. Then, suddenly, a candle flickered in the wind, and the thin veil between the physical world and something darker seemed to shift. The villagers gasped as the flowers in Babalwa's bouquet began to wither, their vibrant colors fading to gray as if drained of life. The sky, which had been clear moments before, darkened unnaturally, heavy clouds rolling in from nowhere. Babalwa's hands trembled, but still she did not speak. The silence stretched out unbearably, each second thick with foreboding. Fondo, the elder who had warned Lungelo, stepped forward, his voice shaking with age and fear.
She must not speak.
He shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd.
If she does, it'll be too late for us all.
Lungelo, confused and shaken, turned to Babalwa, his eyes pleading.
Say something,
he whispered, his voice low and urgent.
Please, my love, break your silence. I need to hear your voice.
But Babalwa's lips remained sealed. Her silence, once a mystery that enchanted him, now felt like a barrier, an impenetrable wall between them. He reached for her hands, feeling the coldness that had seeped into her skin. The villagers, sensing the danger, began to step back, the mood shifting from one of celebration to fear. A deep, rumbling sound began to rise from the ground beneath them, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. The ancient trees of Nkanyezi forest swayed violently, their branches reaching toward the sky like dark hands. The wind whipped around the hill, howling through the village below, and suddenly all the torches that had been lit for the ceremony were extinguished at once, plunging them into an eerie twilight. Babalwa looked up at Lungelo, tears brimming in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to explain everything, but she knew what her words would bring. She had been born into this silence, born by an ancient curse tied to her ancestors, and her silence was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. But now, with Lungelo standing before her, begging for her voice, the temptation was too strong. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the bride to break the vow that had bound her for so long. The wind howled across Nzika's hill, its cold fingers tearing at the fabric of Babalwa's veil, as if trying to pull her away from Lungelo. The villagers, huddled together in fear, could feel something unnatural in the air, The older women whispered prayers, while the men clenched their hands around their walking sticks, unsure of how to protect themselves from an enemy they could not see. Lungelo, still grasping Babalwa's hands, looked around in confusion. The vibrant colors of the day had drained. The sky darkened with heavy clouds that had no business being there. He had never been one to believe in curses or old tales, but something was happening, something far beyond his understanding. He turned to the priestess, Thandolwethu, his voice urgent. "What is going on? Why won't she speak?" Thandolwethu's eyes were wide with fear as she hesitated, her hands trembling over the sacred text she held. She had never wanted to be part of a cursed wedding, but tradition bound her to the ceremony.
"There are things in this village, Lungelo, that should never be spoken of. Babalwa's silence is not by choice,"
she said, her voice low, barely above a whisper.
"She is bound by the blood of her ancestors."
Lungelo's heart raced. He had dismissed the legends as mere superstition, but now the pieces began to fall into place. The elders' warnings, the fearful whispers, the strange looks that had followed Babalwa all her life. This was no myth. This was real. Before he could speak again, Fundo, the eldest man in the village, stepped forward, his voice cracking with the weight of years.
Lungelo, you do not understand what you've asked of her. Babalwa's silence is what protects us all. The women of her family, they carry the burden of an ancient pact made long ago when this village was founded.
Lungelo's face hardened.
What are you saying? What pact?
Fundo, his eyes clouded with both wisdom and sorrow, began to tell the story, his words heavy with the weight of centuries.
"Long ago, before our ancestors settled here, this land was not ours. It belonged to the spirits of the Nkanyezi first. The first was alive then, not just with animals, but with something older, something darker. Our ancestors made a deal with those spirits for the land, to build our village, to live in peace. In return, they promised their silence."
Lungelo frowned, still not understanding.
What does this have to do with Babalwa?
Fundo continued, his voice now a low rasp.
The women of Babalwa's family are the key to that pact. It is said that if any of them speaks on their wedding day, the pact will be broken, and the spirits of the forest will return to claim what was once theirs. They will unleash darkness upon the land, and no one will be safe.
Lungelo's chest tightened with disbelief.
You telling me that this curse has bound her in silence all her life? That it was her family's responsibility to carry this burden?
Thandolwethu nodded solemnly.
It is not by choice. The silent is not just to protect Babalwa. It protects all of us. If she speaks today, she will break the bond and the spirits will awaken.
Lungelo turned to Babalwa, his mind racing. He had asked her to speak, begged her to break the silence that had always stood between them. But now he understood the truth. Her silence wasn't just a barrier. It was the one thing keeping the darkness at bay. But it was too late. Babalwa's lips trembled, tears slipping down her cheeks. Lungelo saw it in her eyes, the conflict tearing her apart. She loved him, and yet her love was bound by the curse of her ancestors. She had never wanted to break the silence, but in that moment, seeing Lungelo's desperation, her heart could not bear it. He had been the one person who believed in her, who didn't treat her like a fragile ghost in the village. He had given her hope. And so, with trembling lips, she spoke, "Lungelo." Her voice was barely a whisper, soft and fragile, but it carried the weight of centuries. As the sound escaped her, the earth beneath them shuddered. The very air around them seemed to crack, as if something unseen had broken free from its chains. The wind, which had been a cold, biting force, turned into a violent storm. The trees of the Nkanyezi forest groaned and twisted as if awakening from a long slumber. Shadows began to move unnaturally, stretching from the trees toward the village, crawling like living creatures made of darkness. The villagers screamed, many of them running for the safety of their homes. But there was nowhere to hide. The ground beneath the hill began to crack, splitting open as tendrils of dark mist rose from the earth. Lungelo, horrified, held Babalwa close, but he knew that something terrible had been unleashed. Out of the fissures in the earth, a figure began to emerge, a dark, shifting form that seemed to be made of the very shadows that crept through the village. Its face was undefined, but its presence radiated ancient power and vengeance. The spirit of the Nkanyezi forest had awoken, freed by Babalwa's voice.
"Leave this place!"
The spirit hissed, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to echo from the earth itself.
"The pact is broken. The silence has been shattered. Now we will reclaim what is ours."
Lungelo, panic rising in his chest, tried to shield Babalwa from the darkness that was spreading across the hill, but it was no use. The spirit was relentless, and the village was already beginning to fall into chaos. Flames erupted from the houses below, the sky darkening as if night had descended in an instant. Babalwa, trembling in Lungelo's arms, knew what she had done. She had broken the vow, unleashed the darkness that had been held in check by her ancestors for so long. There was only one way to stop it. She looked into Lungelo's eyes, her heart breaking, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Before he could stop her, Babalwa pulled away, her steps sure but heavy as he walked toward the dark spirit. Lungelo shouted after her, trying to reach for her, but she was already too far. She stood before the spirit, her head bowed in submission. "This is my burden," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I will carry it once more." The spirit loomed over her, the darkness swirling around them both. The villagers watched, frozen in terror, as Babalwa, with the last of her strength, spoke a single word in an ancient tongue of her ancestors, a word that Lungelo didn't understand, but that seemed to resonate with the land itself. In that instant, the darkness stopped. The spirit, its wrath still burning, hesitated, as if recognizing the power in her voice. Then, with a final earth-shattering roar, it vanished back into the fissures from which it had emerged, taking the darkness with it. Babalwa collapsed to the ground, her silence returning. The storm that had ravaged the hill fell eerily silent. The ground, once cracked and bleeding darkness, had sealed itself, leaving only faint scars where the fissures had opened. The villagers, huddled below in terrified clusters, slowly emerged from their hiding places, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The air, thick with dread moments before, now carried only the scent of rain and earth. Lungelo rushed to where Babalwa had fallen. His heart pounded as he knelt beside her, pulling her limp body into his arms. Her skin was cold to the touch, her eyes half closed, her face pale and serene as if she had nearly fallen asleep. He shook her gently, whispering her name, but there was no response. The silence that had once been her shield now surrounded her in stillness, a silence that would never be broken again.
"Babalwa, please, wake up!"
he murmured, his voice cracking. He pressed his forehead to hers, willing her to open her eyes, to smile, to speak, even though he now understood the terrible weight her words had carried. But she remained still, her breathing shallow, her life slipping away with each passing second. Behind them, the villagers began to gather, their faces marked with sorrow and awe. The elders, their eyes filled with the burden of knowledge, bowed their heads in reverence. They understood what had happened. The curse had been unleashed, but Babalwa, the last of her line, had taken it back upon herself. She had given her life to save them all. Fondo, the oldest elder, stepped forward, his voice heavy with grief.
She has done what no one else could. She has given herself to the spirits as her ancestors once did. The pact is restored, but at a great cost.
Lungelo looked up, his eyes filled with tears.
This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to save her.
Fundo's gaze softened.
You did save her in a way. You gave her the chance to know love, something that was always denied to her. But the curse, it was never something love could overcome.
Thandolwe, the priestess, placed her hand on Lungelo's shoulder.
Her silence was not just a burden, it was her strength. She carried it for all of us, and in the end, she used it to protect us.
Lungelo's chest ached with the weight of their words. He had thought that by making Babalwa speak, he would free her, that he could break the silence that had kept them apart. But now he realized that his silence was never something to be broken. It was the only thing holding the darkness back. He looked down at Babalwa's face, her expression peaceful despite the horror that had just unfolded. Gently, he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her softly.
I'm sorry,
he whispered.
I didn't understand.
For a long moment, he simply held her, feeling the last remnants of warmth fade from her skin. The villagers stood in silence, honoring the sacrifice that Babalwa had made, knowing that the story of the bride who never spoke would have been passed down for generations, a legend forever etched into the soul of the village. The weeks that followed were marked by quiet mourning. The village slowly returned to its routines, but the memory of what had happened on Ziga's Hill lingered in the air, like a shadow that could never be fully chased away. Babalwa was buried at the edge of the Nkanyezi forest, where the trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches brushing against the sky. Her grave was marked by a simple stone, but the villagers often left offerings, flowers, beads, and whispered prayers of gratitude for the woman who had saved them all. Lungelo stayed in the village. Though he had once planned to return to the city, his heart was too heavy with loss to leave the place where Babalwa had lived and died. Every day he would visit her grave, sitting beside the stone in quiet reflection, wondering what her life might have been like if the curse had never existed, if she could have lived without the weight of silence pressing on her shoulders. But as the months passed, he began to understand that Babalwa's silence had not been a prison. It had been her power. Her strength lay in what she held back, in the words she never spoke, in the love she had shown through her actions, not through her voice. The villagers spoke of her in hushed tones, their children growing up on the stories of the bride who never spoke, the woman who had saved them all. Her legend grew, becoming part of the fabric of Khanya, a tale of love, sacrifice, and the dangers of breaking ancient promises. Lungelo, however, carried the memory of Babalwa not as a legend, but as a love that had changed him forever. He would never hear her voice again, but his silence remained with him, a reminder of the depth of her heart and the sacrifice she had made for the village and for him. And so, under the shadow of the Nkanyezi forest, where the trees whispered ancient secrets, To those who listened, the story of Babalwa, the bride who never spoke, lived on.